Hello everyone. This video is a reading of We Aren't Superstitious. It is intended to give you some background knowledge on the Salem witch trials and then to help you in your understanding of the crucible as we read it. Please follow along in your packets and make sure you're answering the corresponding questions as we go along as well. We are wiser now. We do not believe in witches. Usually, our little superstitious rituals and propitiations don't hurt our daily lives. Usually, and then on occasion, a superstition, a belief, flares into crowd madness and kills again before it has run its course, as it did in Salem Village in 1692. That story is worth retelling, as a very typical example of what wild belief and crowd hysteria can do to an average community. For Salem Village in 1691 was no different in any way from any one of a dozen little New England hamlets. There was the main road and the parsonage, and the meeting house, the blockhouse, the Ingersoll house where travelers put up for the night, the 8 or 9 other houses that made up the village. Beyond lay the outlying farms with their hard-working farmers, 15 miles away. The overgrown village that was Boston. As for the men and women of Salem Village, they were tough and naughty stock, if you like, not widely lettered, not particularly tolerant, especially in religion, but no different from their neighbors at Andover and Topsfield or in Boston itself. There were sensible men and stupid men among them, model housewives and slatterns, troublemakers, and more peaceable folk. They lived a life of hard work and long winters, drank rum on occasion, took their religion with the mixture of grimness and enthusiasm that marked the Puritan, and intended, under God's providence, to beat wilderness and Indian and wax and increase the land. They were a great deal more human, crotchety, colorful than the schoolbook pictures of dour-faced men in the steeple-crowned hats would suggest. And yet, to this ordinary community in the early spring of 1692 came a madness that was to shake all Massachusetts before its fever was burned out. We are wiser now. We do not believe in witches. But if, say, 3 cases of vasatic cholera were discovered in your own hometown and certified as such by the local Board of Health, and if your local newspaper promptly ran a boxed warning on the front page to all citizens, you would have some faint idea of how the average Salem villager felt when the afflicted children denounced their first victims. For witchcraft to almost all the New Englanders of 1692 was a definite, diagnosable, and dangerous and evil as bubonic plague. It had its symptoms, its prognosis, and its appalling results. Belief in it was as firmly fixed in most people's minds as belief in the germ theory of disease is in ours. People believed in witches. Why should they not? They were in the Bible. Even the Bible itself said, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." They were in every old wives' tale that was whispered about in the winter fires, and in 1692 they were in Salem Village. 3 years before, Salem Village had got a new minister, the Reverend Samuel Parris, ex-merchant in the West Indies. He seems to have been a self-willed, self-important man with a great sense of his own and the church's dignity. He brought with him to Salem Village 2 West Indian servants, a man known as John Indian and a woman named Tituba. And when he brought those 2 in the West Indies, he was buying rope that was to hang 19 men and women of New England. So odd are the links in the circumstantial chain. Perhaps the 9-year-old Elizabeth Parris, the daughter of the parsonage, boasted to her new friends of the odd stories Tituba told and the queer things she could do. Perhaps Tituba herself let the report of her magic powers be spread about the village. In any case, during the winter of 1691 and 1692, a group of girls and women began to meet nightly at the parsonage, with Tituba and her fortune-telling as the chief attraction. Elizabeth Parris, at 9, was the youngest. Then came Abigail Williams, 11, and Ann Putnam, 12. The rest were older. Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, and Elizabeth Hubbard were 17. Elizabeth Booth and Susan Sheldon, 18, and Mary Warren and Sarah Churchill, 20. 3 were servants. Mercy Lewis worked for the Putnams. Mary Warren was a maid at John Proctor's. Sarah Churchill at the George Jacobs. All except for Elizabeth Parris were adolescent or just leaving adolescence. The elder women included a pair of gossipy, superstitious busybodies, Mrs. Pope and Mrs. Bibber, and young Ann Putnam's mother, Ann Putnam Sr., a handsome woman of 30 who could cherish a grudge and revenge it. The circle met, the circle continued to meet, no doubt, with the usual giggling, whispering, and gossip. From mere fortune-telling, it proceeded to other and more serious matters, Table rapping, perhaps, and a little West Indian voodoo. Weird stories told by Tituba and weird things shown while the wind blew outside and the big shadows flickered on the wall. Soon the members of the circle began to show hysterical symptoms. They crawled under tables and chairs. They made strange sounds. They shook and trembled with nightmare fears. Something strange and out of nature was happening. Who had ever seen normal young girls behave like these young girls? And no one even suggested that a mixed diet of fortune-telling, ghost stories, and voodoo is hardly the thing for impressionable minds during a long New England winter. Hysteria was possession by an evil spirit. Pathological lying, the devil putting words into one's mouth. The Reverend Samuel Parris became very busy. Grave ministers were called in to look at the afflicted children. It was almost too terrible to believe, and yet what else could be believed? Witchcraft. Meanwhile, one may suppose, the afflicted children, like most hysterical subjects, enjoyed the odd stares, the horrified looks, the respectful questions that greeted them. They had been unimportant girls of a little hamlet. Now they were, in every sense of the word, spot news. They continued to writhe and demonstrate and be the center of attention. There was only one catch about it. If they were really bewitched, somebody must be doing the bewitching. On February 29, 1692, in the midst of an inappropriate storm of thunder and lightning, 3 women, Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba, were arrested on the deadly charge of bewitching the children. The next day, March 1st, 2 magistrates, Justice Hawthorne and Justice Corwin, arrived with appropriate pomp and ceremony. The first hearing was held in the crowded meeting house of the village, and all Salem swarmed to it, as crowds in our time have swarmed to other sleepy little villages, suddenly notorious. The children in Tituba had picked their first 2 victims well. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne were old women of no particular standing in the community. Sarah Good had been a beggar and a slattern. Her husband testified, according to report, and with a smugness that made one long to kick him, that she either was a witch or would be one very quickly. As for Sarah Osborne, she had married a redemptioner servant after the death of her former husband and probably lost caste in the consequence. Also, she had been bedridden for some time and therefore not as regular in her church attendance as a good Christian should be. We can imagine that meeting house and the country crowd within it on that chill March day. At one end was the majesty of the law and the afflicted children, where all might see them and observe, dressed in their best, very likely, and with solicitous relatives near at hand. And then there was the accused, the old woman, the witch. The justices, grim Justice Hawthorne in particular, had evidently arrived with their minds made up. For the first question addressed to Sarah Good was bluntly, "What evil spirit have you familiarity with?" "None," said the piping old voice. "Have you made no contracts with the devil?" proceeded the justice. "No." The justice went to the root of the matter at once. "Why do you hurt these children?" A rustle must have gone through the meeting house at that. "Aye, that's it." The justice speaks shrewdly. "Hark to the justice." "Aye, but look too. Look at the children. Poor things, poor things." "I do not hurt them. I scorn it," said Sarah Good, defiantly, but the justice had her now. He was not to be brushed aside. "Who, then, do you employ to do it?" "I employ nobody." "What creature do you employ, then?" For all witches had familiars. "No creature, but I am falsely accused." But the sweat must have been on the old woman's palms by now. It was time for Exhibit A. The justice turned to the children. Was Sarah Good one of the persons who tormented them? Yes, yes, and a horrified murmur running through the crowd. And then, before the awe-stricken eyes of all, they began to be tormented. They writhed, they grew stiff, they contorted, they were stricken, moaning, or speechless. Yet, when they were brought to Sarah Good and allowed to touch her, they grew quite quiet and calm, for as everyone knew, a witch's body reabsorbed, on touch, the force discharged by witchcraft into the bodies of the tormented. Everybody could see what happened. When the meeting house was quiet, the justice spoke again. "Sarah Good, do you not see now what you have done? Why do you not tell us the truth? Why do you torment these poor children?" And with these words, Sarah Good was already hanged. For all she could say was, "I do not torment them." And yet, everyone had seen her with their own eyes. Sarah Osborne's examination followed the same course, the same prosecutor's first questions, the same useless denial, the same feats of the afflicted children, the same end. Then Tituba was examined and gave them their fill of marvels, prodigies, and horrors. The West Indian woman, a slave in a strange land, was fighting for her life, and she did it shrewdly and desperately. She admitted, repentantly, that she had tormented the children, but she had been forced to do so. By whom? By Goody Good and Goody Osborne and the other witches whom she hadn't yet been able to recognize. Her voodoo knowledge aided her. She filled the open ears of justices and crowds with tales of hairy familiars and black dogs, red cats and black cats and yellow birds, the phantasm of a woman with legs and wings, and everybody could see that she spoke the truth. For when she was first brought in, the children were tormented at her presence. But as soon as she had confessed and turned king's evidence, she was tormented herself, and fearfully, to Boston jail with her, but she had saved her neck. The hearing was over. The men and women of Salem and its outlying farms went broodingly or excitedly back to their homes to discuss the fearful workings of God's providence. Here and there a common-sense voice murmured a doubt or two. Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne were no great losses to the community, but still, to convict two old women of heinous crime on the testimony of green sick girls and a West Indian slave. But on the whole, the villagers of Salem felt relieved. The cause of the plague had been found, it would be stamped out, and the afflicted children recover. The justices, no doubt, congratulated themselves on their prompt and intelligent action. The afflicted children slept. After a tiring day, they were not quite so used to such performances as they were to become. As for the accused women, they went to Boston jail to be chained there, while awaiting trial and gallows. Only Sarah Osborne was not to go to the gallows. She died in jail instead, some 5.5 weeks later. And Tituba stayed smugly in prison till the madness collapsed, and was then sold to the colony to defray the expenses of her imprisonment. One wonders who brought her, and whether she ever got back to the West Indies. But with that, her enigmatic figure disappears from the scene. Meanwhile, on an outlying farm, Giles Corey, a turbulent, salty old fellow of 81, began to argue the case that his wife Martha. He believed, fanatically, in the afflicted children. He did not, and said so, even going so far as to say that the magistrates were blinded and that she could open their eyes. It was one of those marital disputes that occur between strong-willed people, and it was to bring Martha Corey to the gallows and Giles Corey to an even stranger doom. Yet now there was a lull through which people whispered. As for what went on in the middle of the minds of the afflicted children during the lull, we may not say, but this much is evident. They had seen and felt their power. The hearing had been the greatest and most exciting event of their narrow lives, and it was so easy to do. They grew more and more ingenious with each rehearsal. You twisted your body and grown people were afraid. Add to this 3 servant girls, with the usual servants' grudges against present or former masters. Add to this that high-strung, dominant woman, Ann Putnam Sr., who could hold a grudge. Such a grudge that there might be against Rebecca Nurse, for instance, who had taken the other side in a bounty dispute. So just suppose that she were found to be a witch, and hadn't Tituba disposed that there were other women besides Good and Osborne who made her torment the children? On March 19th, Martha Corey and Rebecca Nurse were arrested on the charge of witchcraft. On March 21st, they were examined and committed, and with that, the real reign of terror begins. For if Martha Corey, notably religious and God-fearing, and Rebecca Nurse, saintly and thoughtful, could be witches, no one in Salem or New England was safe from the charge. The examinations were brutally unfair. The children, yet bolder and more daring, they would interrupt questions now to shout that a black man was whispering in the prisoner's ear. If the accused stood still, they were tormented. If she moved her hands, they suffered even greater agonies. Their self-confidence became monstrous. There was no trick too fantastic for them to try. By now, Salem Village was no longer sane. Let us get the rest of it over quickly. The Salem witches ceased to be Salem's affair. They became a matter affecting the whole colony. Sir William Phipps, the new governor, appointed a special court to try the cases, and the hangings began. All through the summer, the accusations, the arrests, the trials came thick and fast, till the jails were crowded. Nor were those now accused friendless old beldames like Sarah Good. They included Captain John Eldon, son of Miles Standish's friend, who saved himself by breaking jail, and the wealthy and prominent Englishes who saved themselves by flight. The most disgraceful scenes occurred at the trial of the saintly Rebecca Nurse. 39 citizens of Salem were brave enough to sign a petition for her, and the jury brought in a verdict of not guilty. The mob in the sweating courtroom immediately began to cry out, and the presiding judge as much as told the jury to reverse their verdict. They did so, to the mob's delight, and then the governor pardoned her, and certain gentlemen of Salem, and perhaps the mob persuaded him into reversing his pardon. She was hanged on Gallows Hill on July 19th with Sarah Good, Sarah Wilds, Elizabeth Howe, and Susanna Martin. Susanna Martin's only witchcraft seems to have been that she was an unusually tidy woman, and had once walked a muddy road without getting her dress bedraggled. As for Elizabeth Howe, a neighbor testified, "I have been acquainted with Goodwife Howe as a neighbor for 9 or 10 years, and I never saw any harm in her, but found her just in her dealings and faithful to her promises. I never heard her rival any person, but she always pitied them and said, 'I pray God forgive them now.' But the children cried, 'I am stuck with a pin, I am pinched,' when they saw her, and she hanged." It took a little more to hang the Reverend George Burroughs. He had been Salem Village's second minister, then gone on a parish in Maine, and the cloth had great sanctity. But Ann Putnam and Mercy Lewis managed to doom him, with the able assistance of the rest of the troop. Mr. Burroughs was unfortunate enough to be a man of unusual physical strength. Anyone who could lift a gun by putting 4 fingers in its barrel must do so by magic arts. Also, he had been married 3 times. So when the ghosts of his first 2 wives, dressed in winding sheets, appeared to Ann Putnam and cried out that Mr. Burroughs had murdered them, the cloth could not save him then. Perhaps one of the most pathetic documents connected with the trials is the later petition of his orphan children. It begins, "We were left a parcel of small children, helpless." Here and there in the records gleams a flash of the frantic common sense. Susanna Martin laughs when Ann Putnam and her daughter go into convulsions at her appearance. When asked why, she says, "Well, I may at such folly. I never hurt this woman or her child in my life." John Proctor, the prosperous farmer who employed Mary Warren, said sensibly before his arrest, "If these girls are left alone, we will all be devils and witches. They all ought to be sent to the whipping post." He was right enough about it, but his servant helped hang him. One hanging on June 10th, 5 on July 19th, 5 on August 19th, 8 on September 22nd, including Martha Corey, but for stubborn Giles Corey, a different fate was reserved. The old man had begun by believing in the whole hocus-pocus. He had quarreled with his wife about it. He had seen her arrested as a witch, insulted by the magistrates, condemned to die. 2 of his son-in-laws had testified against her. He himself had been closely questioned as to her actions. Now he himself was in danger as well. Well, he could die as his wife would, but there was the property, his goods, his prospering lands. By law, the goods and property of those convicted of witchcraft were confiscated by the state and the name attainted. With a curious, grim heroism, Giles Corey drew up a will leaving that property to the 2 son-in-laws who had not joined in the prevailing madness. And then at his trial, he said, "I will not plead. If I deny I am condemned already in courts where ghosts appear as witnesses and swear men's lives away." A curious grim heroism? It was so, for those who refused to plead either guilty or not guilty in such a suit were liable to the old English punishment, called peine forte et dure. It consisted in heaping weights or stones upon the unhappy victim till he accepted a plea, or until his chest was crushed. And exactly that happened to old Giles Corey. They heaped the stones upon him until they killed him, and 2 days before his wife was hanged, he died. But his property went to the 2 loyal son-in-laws without confiscation, and his name was not attainted. So died Giles Corey, New England to the bone. And then, suddenly and fantastically as the madness had come, it was gone. The afflicted children, at long last, had gone too far. They had accused the governor's lady. They had accused Mrs. Hall, the wife of the minister at the Beverly, and a woman known throughout the colony for her virtues. And there comes a point when driven men and women revolt against blood and horror. It went on logically. No one but the afflicted children and their protégés would be left alive. In January 1693, the Superior Court brought 21 to trial and condemned 3, but no one was executed. In May 1693, a proclamation emptied the jails. So it ended, and in 1706, Ann Putnam made public confession that she had been deluded by the devil in testifying as she had. She had testified in every case but one, and in 1711 the colony of Massachusetts paid £578 in all to the heirs of various victims. What happened to the survivors? Well, the Reverend Samuel Parris quit Salem Village to go into business in Boston and died at Sudbury in 1720. Ann Putnam died in 1716, and from the stock of the Putnams sprang Israel Putnam, the Revolutionary hero. From the stock of the witches, the nurses, and the others sprang excellent and distinguished people of service to state and nation. In hanging, Judge Hawthorne's descendant was Nathaniel Hawthorne, but Mercy Lewis and the rest of the afflicted children just went on and lived their lives. It is well for us to consider Salem. It was a town like another, and a strange madness took hold of it. But it is stranger madness to hang a man for witchcraft than to hang him for the shape of his nose or the color of his skin. Well, we are not superstitious, no. Well, let us be sure we are not. For persecution follows superstition, and intolerance as fire follows the fuse. And once we light that fuse, we cannot foresee where the fire will burn or what it will consume, any more than they could in Salem so many years ago.